Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So today I want to discuss an interview that went down, it had to have been over a year ago. And, there's so much material that comes out of Brazil that I think is noteworthy. And just being one YouTuber, I can't cover all of it. Sometimes I put stuff on the back burner and say, okay, I have to come back to this story. But this particular interview continues to circulate on social network accounts, right? So I happened to see this on my Instagram feed a couple of days ago. I'm like, wow, I forgot all about that interview. I definitely have to talk about it because if I want to stay true to what I talk about, analyzing Brazil from the perspective of race, there's enough content that comes out, incidents that come out every day that give you a clear idea of what race relations are like in Brazil. Brazil has always presented itself as a country that has nothing in common with the United States in terms of race relations. They always say, well, we never had a KKK. We never had legalized segregation. Well, in some ways that's true, some ways it's not. Because on the one hand, as I said, maybe they never had legalized segregation in the country, but a law that they had on the books for many years was they prohibited any more Africans coming into the country after they abolished slavery. They wanted to make sure that no more Africans came into the country. So it was actually written into the law that they would not allow Africans or also at the time Asian people to come into the country. So there you have a law banning more Black people from coming into the country. Okay. Now, in terms of segregation, no, I don't. As far as I know, Brazil has never had any legalized segregation, but it has always functioned in a similar to a manner that you could find in the north of the United States. So, it's often said that, Jim Crow existed in the South of the United States, whereas in the North it didn't exist. But people clearly followed social standards for where they allowed Black people to be and where they didn't want to see Black people. And you see numerous cities throughout Brazil where they have this same history. So, no, it was never legally sanctioned. But when you have a society that says, we don't want Black people walking here or on this property, that's almost the same thing. So you're really not going to understand how Brazil functions until you look behind the curtain and you deal with all of these little, the Brazilian way of doing segregation and racism. Another telltale sign of how people deal with race in Brazil is that as Brazil was the country that imported the most Africans for slave labor, slavery was such a huge factor in social and racial relations that here it is, what, 100 and let me say 88, it's probably been 135 years since slavery ended in Brazil, but yet the people who consider themselves white, who see people who are non-white, they still look at themselves as being superior to these people. And it comes out the way that they talk to people, the way they treat people. So these are some of the ways that you look at a society and say, okay, if you're a person who doesn't live in Brazil and you consider moving to Brazil, how does Brazil treat Black people? That's something that you should ask. And I lived there for 9 years. I can say I never really had any. I can't really claim that I had any race problems in terms of me being a Black American there. But I think a lot of that has to do with I'm being from the United States, where Brazil looks at the United States like it's a superior country. Whether it's true or not, Brazilians often look to the U.S. as that's a country that we should emulate ourselves after. Now, Black people who come to Brazil from other countries, whether they're African countries or they're from places like Haiti, those people often get treated a whole lot different than just say Black Americans. There's numerous stories online, and some of them are on the blog the Black Brazil Today blog, that just show how Brazil treats uh, African immigrants or Haitian immigrants. It doesn't speak to my situation because, as I said, if people would have known that if they would have believed I was from Haiti or from the African continent, I probably would have been treated different also. So this is another way that we we can kind of get ideas of how Brazil looks at Black people. And this is something that you can look to if you consider moving to Brazil. These are some things that you, as a tourist, you may not notice this, but once you settle into the country, you start reading the news, you start seeing what people talk about on social networks, and you'll get a clear understanding of what this means. Now, the material I want to talk about today has to do with a woman who I often introduce as Brazil's top Black actress. Her name is Taís Araújo. I've known about her since I got into Brazil. When I first started looking into Brazil, her and another actress, Isabel Filarges, were on House of Brazil magazine. I'm like, wow, this is Black people in Brazil. I never thought about it. Thais went on to become, like I said, she's been in the business, I don't know, since arguably the mid 90s. And I would argue that she's the top Black actress there. But in this interview from last year, she talked about something that a lot of Black Brazilians can relate to. And that is Brazil can't deal with Black people when they're not in positions of subservience. Successful Blacks bother people, says actress Taís Araújo. Now, why would she say that? There's enough material on the Black Brazil Today blog that you can see some examples of what she's talking about. Just I did this report in October of 2022, a little bit over a year ago, where this comedian musician who had made a name for himself online, he was being constantly harassed in this, I don't know, you could say middle class apartment building where he was living. And I knew where this apartment was, because maybe it was about 10 or 15 minutes from where I used to live in Sao Paulo. And the woman was caught on video like, "Get out of here, monkey." And so in Sao Paulo, comedian musician Eddie Jr. leaves his apartment after racist attack. Incident triggers protest in front of the apartment. There was video of this woman knocking on his door. There was video of her and her son at his door with a broken bottle, and I think he might have had a knife. Like, why are you harassing this guy? Obviously, he pays money. He gets paid very well to be able to afford to live in this apartment, but you have a problem with him living there. That's just one incident. I mean, I speak on all the topics that I talk about on the blog and in YouTube, on this YouTube channel. I could make a whole blog or YouTube channel just on these particular topics. Here's another one from 2018. How could a neguinha, well, some people might translate neguinha as a little Black girl, but when it's used with racial content or as a racial slur, you could say the little N-word girl. How could this neguinha live in the same apartment, the same building as me? Black woman impeded from entering her own apartment by two white men. So this is a woman who's talking about this, and she just broke down how she was coming home to her apartment building, and these men tried to stop her from coming in because obviously they couldn't believe she lived in the Pinheiros district of Sao Paulo. And Pinheiros, you got to have some pretty good money to live in Pinheiros. It's a solidly middle, some people might say upper middle class neighborhood. And she came to the conclusion that it doesn't matter how much money I have, nor that I'm dressed well. What mattered to them was the color of my skin. Like, how could a neguinha live in the same building as me? And no matter what she showed, these guys were having a problem with her. She says, he positioned himself in front of me, blocking my passage. I also point out that I was dressed better than Michelle Obama herself. I turned away from the racist and continued on my way to the second gate. He then, not satisfied, asked me to prove that I lived there and that I show my key. He asked for my apartment number. He asked me to open the second gate to see if I had the key. I showed my ID when my friend asked if he lived there in a mocking tone. The point is, he judged what she looked like and said, there's no way that this Black girl could live in this apartment building. It's still an everyday attitude that says, Black people can't have more than what I have. They can't be equal to what I am. People can deny it all you want, but it comes out in the news every day. And now that you have social networks, Black people are telling these stories themselves, like, this is what happened to me. I find it intriguing that she said I was better dressed than Michelle Obama herself, because Michelle Obama's name is going to come up in another article, the one that I'm talking about today. But let's keep going. Black woman in a nice home, she must be the maid. Now, this was a skit that was made, it might have been in 2019, because that's when the article, when I did it, I covered it. And in the skit, they're mocking the idea that when a person goes to a house in a certain neighborhood, If a black woman answered the door, they automatically assume that she has to be the maid because this woman can't possibly earn enough money to be living in a neighborhood and in a house like this. So that's what this skit was all about. They played it out. And, for somebody to make a skit about this to satirize something, it means that this is something that happens in Brazil all the time. A black woman opens the door, and so whoever's at the door says, "May I speak to the lady of the house?" This video satirizes Brazil's belief that a black woman in a middle class home must be a maid or the cleaning lady. This is what this cartoon says, talking about the new black middle class. The guy here says, "I want to speak to the lady of the house." And she says, the black woman says, "You can speak." He says, "Oh, he must really trust a lot in you, but I want to speak with him personally." So this is what he's saying here. Like, okay, I know you speaking for your boss, but really I want to speak to him personally, assuming that she can't be the lady of the house in this type of apartment or type of house. So hence the idea, if a black woman opens a door in a middle class home, she has to be the maid. That's what this whole skit was all about. It was kind of comical. Then you have this guy, Renee Silva. Renee Silva made his name by creating this community newspaper. I forget what neighborhood, but it was in Rio de Janeiro some years ago. I actually met Renee, I think in 2014. He considered one of the most influential blacks under the age of 40. Renee Silva still has to deal with attitudes that blacks should stay in their place. So this is Renee Silva, and he was just talking about how people perceived him being on a flight. So it says here, recently he saw this attitude expressed in his presence. Considered one of the 100 most influential blacks under the age of 40, one wouldn't be able to tell based on what Silva heard in preparation for a flight to Aeroporto Santos Dumont in Rio's South Zone, a flight he was catching to the city of Belo Horizonte in the state of Minas Gerais. So what happened? Upon boarding his flight, he heard a woman making a comment that seemed to express her displeasure with his presence. According to Silva, the woman said the following to a friend nearby. She says, quote, "Brazil is really a mess because in the old days, this," talking about plane flights, "was something for the chic people. And nowadays, anyone is flying." Pointing her eyes towards her neighbor's nice armchair, she continued, "Look at the kind of people who fly," in reference to Silva. So again, there's numerous, I've had numerous people talk about this. I've heard people tell me personal stories that this happened to them, or it's just something you see on a social network or something that actually makes it to the mainstream news. Like, people are very bothered. There's an article that I had on the blog that said that the black middle class in Brazil is growing, and there are a lot of people who are they're not happy with that. They're happy seeing black people in the subservient role that they're accustomed to seeing them. As I said, when I first started going to Brazil, my first few trips to Sao Paulo, you just didn't see I didn't see black people in the airport either catching flights or working in the Guarulhos airport. It's been a drastic difference in what you see. When you catch a flight in Brazil now, you see more black people. It's still overwhelmingly people who would be considered white or consider themselves white on flights. But believe me, there's been an increase of black Brazilians being able to catch airplane flights in Brazil over the last, say, 10, 15 years. And the reason why people still look at black people as subservient is Brazil's 350-year experiment with human bondage. Even today, you still get stories out of Brazil talking about black people working, not specifically black people, but the majority of times when people are caught working in conditions what they call analogous to slavery, it's usually black folks that they find. Slavery in 2020, people working in conditions analogous to slavery. 125 years since the abolition of slavery, but today 8 out of 10 people working in conditions analogous to slavery are of African descent. 89-year-old black woman subjected to slavery in the city of Santos for 50 years. This is from 2022. Woman living in conditions similar to slavery for 38 years, released by authorities. These stories go on and on. I could write a story about this every day because it still goes on in Brazil. Finding black folks who are basically trapped in a condition where they're working free for usually a white family. Okay. In 2015, I wrote a piece that was called "Comments on Social Network Pages Show that Brazil Still Has a Nostalgic Feeling About Slavery," says researcher. Yeah, so it's some of the jokes that you hear in Brazilian society still are throwbacks to, like, wow, in slavery, we could do this with black people. While I wish slavery was still, existed, There was a picture of a guy who was sitting on a university campus with I don't know, he was sitting on a bench with some people, and somebody took a picture of him and say, "Hey, whose slave is this that got away?" or something to that degree. Brazil still looks at Black people as slaves. This is from 2016. Throwback to the slavery era. In the city of Vassouras, descendant of a plantation owner dresses as a mistress and employees as slaves to greet and serve tourists. She turned a family plantation into a modern day, she, how can we say, she set up a scene and invited people to come and see it. And she replayed and set up the whole plantation as if it was still the slavery era. So as you see this woman right here, and she's got these Black women dressed up as if they're servants on this plantation. Brazilians still have this reminisce, they still have this nostalgic feeling about when slavery existed, right? So this is getting to the crux of the article that I'm talking about today. Black women have long talked about this in Brazil, particularly over the last decade, with more and more Black people moving into the middle classes. The accusation is that Black women are metida, right? Metida meaning stuck up or conceited. So this article from 2017 says, "I'm a conceited Black woman." It's not a compliment, but apparently being a successful, confident Black woman makes some people very uncomfortable. Which brings me to what the article is today, because this is what Taís Araújo is also talking about. So let's get directly into this piece. Brazil can't deal with Black people when they're not in positions of subservience. Successful Blacks bother people, says actress Taís Araújo. The article today is the information comes courtesy of the Correio Brasiliense website as well as the Hugo Gloss website. Okay. So in August of 2022, actress Taís Araújo appeared on a show called Quem Pode Pode. It's a podcast hosted by actress model Giovanna Eubank and actress Fernanda Paes Leme. On this particular episode, Araújo discussed some issues that have consistently come up when the topic is her personal and professional life. Among the topics she addressed was the racism she experienced being TV Global's first Black leading lady and arguably Brazil's top Black actress. Now, as I've said, TV Global, or Rede Global as they call in Brazil, has for a long time been Brazil's top television network. It just absolutely, I hadn't looked at the ratings lately, but all the years that I've studied Brazil, global television has always been, way ahead of its competitors. So if you get a slot on global TV, it's like you're set. It opens up the door for a whole lot of opportunities because it is the country's top TV network. And Taís Araújo, this young lady here, has been in global, I don't know, since the mid to late 90s. And she's done very well for herself. As I said, I would argue that she's the top Black actress in the country. But with her accomplishments, she has long been a reference in the media for Black women. But with such accolades have come a reputation as being conceited or metida, as Brazilians say. So let's get into this video for today. Leading into the topic, Giovanna Eubank acknowledged that over the course of the 10 years in which she's worked at TV Global, she always has viewed Araújo's work with esteem, but having given this compliment, the blonde also said that she has long heard rumors that Araújo was stuck up, both inside of the network studios as well as in other circles. Eubank went on to compare Araújo's position in the media to the position of, again, Michelle Obama, seeing Obama and Araújo as Black women seated in positions of power and how this, in fact, bothers people. Okay, so this is what the podcast looks like. I want to talk about something real quick because this was just really, it's an interesting play on words here. The name of this podcast is Quem Pode Pode, right? Now in Portuguese, Quem Pode means whoever can. And then you have the three words. You see the three letters here, pode, which, pode, P-O-D-E means can in Portuguese, right? And then you have pode, which means podcast. She's talking about it. It's an intriguing play on words. Whoever can do a podcast does a podcast. Basically, what she's saying. I thought that was real slick how they they titled the name of this podcast. But anyway, let's keep going here. So this is just a clip of what the podcast looks like. Asked her view of this reputation, Taís confirmed that she's been labeled as stuck up, conceited, and even angry by many people. I am stuck up. I really am. I've been hearing that since I left the maternity ward. People looked at me and said, wow, what a stuck up girl ever since. She said, laughing. Araujo then went on to point out that she's had to act in a certain way just to survive the white world, a social circle of which she's been a part since she was very young. So Araujo's been part of she's had a different experience growing up than other Black people. I mean, uh, having a middle class experience where most of the people around you are going to be people who look white or are close to white or are actually white is not necessarily a scenario that a lot of Black Brazilians are going to come up with. And if they do come up around white people, if they are poor, they're going to be in the situations where the white people are also poor. But to grow up in a middle class background where most of the people are white is not a situation that most Black people grow up in. I have to, now this is Taís continuing. I have to confess that in my childhood and adolescence, I inevitably had to raise my nose because otherwise I'd be run over. I was always brought up in a very white, very elite place. So if I didn't stand up for myself, I was going to get run over by everyone. And I wasn't looking to get run over by anyone, she admitted. To accent her point, she also shared an incident that went down between her and a work colleague during which she had to use this reputation of being stuck up to put this coworker in check. She continues, there's also a question of posture and the other person's gaze. Once an actor at Global turned to me and said, funny, I don't know any successful Black people who aren't overbearing and arrogant. Then I turned to him and said, come here. Does Tostinis, which is a cookie in Brazil, does Tostinis sell more because it's fresh or is it fresh because it sells more? Could it be that you're not used to seeing Black people in places of power and you only understand Black people in places of subservience? If the Black person isn't subservient to you, do you think it's arrogant? Is it your viewpoint? He didn't have an answer, she recalled. It's funny because the women were listening to her story, and they kind of saw what she was saying, like, wow, that was a wonderful, when she talked about the cookie, they replied, wow, that was wonderful what you said. Thinking of this specific episode, Araújo opined that in Brazil, being a Black person, being in a position of power and influence is something that's quote unquote hard to swallow. I think it's difficult for society, yes, to face, and this goes back to colonial Brazil, a population that was kidnapped, enslaved with some power, looking at you on the same level and responding to you on the same level. Because in white people's subconscious, you have to be subservient. You have to say amen to everything I say. This is a question in the skin of the Brazilian. It's running here in the veins, she says. It's tattooed. It's very difficult for Brazilians to look at a Black woman in the face without calling her conceited, overbearing, and arrogant. It's a look they're not used to, but they'll have to get used to it, she said. So listen to what Taís is saying. And this is a connection that I was making. The position that Brazil continues to see Black people in, regardless of their status in society, they still look at them as if they're beneath white Brazilians. Like, you're supposed to, I say how high and you jump. So then when they run into a Black person whose social condition puts them equal or above them, it's something they don't know how to deal with. And Taís Araújo was saying, hey, look, you're going to have to get used to this. Not only has she succeeded, but now there are more and more Black Brazilians reaching that pinnacle. It's like, y'all going to have to learn how to deal with this because not all Black people are just dirt poor. Okay. This is Cida Bento in this picture here. She's a psychologist with a master's degree and a doctorate in psychology. She's a coordinator and co-founder of the Center for the Study of Labor Relations and Inequalities, which they call CIERT. Bento was listed by the Economist magazine in 2015 as one of the 50 most influential professionals in the world in the field of diversity. Now, Cida Bento has released numerous articles and books on how branquitude or whiteness functions in Brazil. She's broken it down because Brazil is a country where you wouldn't assume that this whole thing of whiteness even plays a role. And when people bring it up, they look at it as like, oh, you're trying to emulate what's going on in the United States. We don't have that problem here. Like, clearly you do. For the fact that for so long, so many people avoided being defined as, Black or brown. This whole idea of, do you know who you're talking to? A white person of the elite demands a certain type of respect. And at the same time, they believe that they can talk to most Black people in any way that they feel necessary. So this is something she studied for years. And it's like, okay, the concept of Brazilians, of whiteness, and how this the white person is on top of the white hierarchy, as I've spoken about this before. Like they deserve a certain level of respect, whereas black people can be treated in any kind of way. Bento notes that the racial change that's underway in Brazil will always be disturbing as there is a fear of losing privileges. Quote, white identity is strengthened when the white person can stand in a place of reference of what is human. When this other, the black person, appears in a position of equality, there is discomfort, she analyzes. She continues, whites, even if they are poor and have limitations, are one step ahead. When an inferior, and I say that in inverted commas, appears in a position of equality with him, the white person losing some of that imaginary superiority in his condition as a universal human being, a person that's supposed to represent humanity is supposed to be in this skin color. This is what Cita Bento is saying. She continues, in general, he doesn't like to meet black people in spaces that would, in theory, be that of white people, such as in the universities. And some years ago, there was a huge discussion that was going on because a lot of white people in middle class households, they were offended that their black maid's daughter managed to make it to the university that their son or daughter was going to. So Brazil still has this problem. It's nothing that you can avoid. It's like the same way you can't deal with racism doesn't exist. you know Running into black people who are not just always poor and in a position of inferiority, don't know how to deal with that. And this is what Taís Araújo was talking about. So even she, being a global actress, she understands where these people are coming from. And it's just like you're going to have to get used to it because more and more black people are moving into these positions of the middle class and having some power and authority. And they're not going to deal with this idea that they're supposed to be down here while the white population is up here. They're not going to deal with it. They're not going to deal with that anymore. So you're going to have to change your attitude when you're dealing with black folks. That's basically what Taisha is saying here. And from the comments that I've read, a lot of people feel this. Like no matter where we get in society, they're still going to look at us as if we're descendants of slaves, and that's how we should be treated. So anyway, curious to know what you all thought about this particular video. Definitely drop a comment in the comment section. Like this video, share this video. Um, Consider subscribing to the channel. Click on that notification bell so that you'll be one of the first people to see my videos when I put them up. And with that said, I'm going to end this video here and ask that you come back, check out the next video that I post.